In The Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley discusses a theory about our brain advanced earlier in the 20th century by French philosopher Henri Bergson and the British philosopher C.D. Broad. Huxley believed that this theory might help explain the nature of visionary experience and mystical consciousness. In this presentation, we will examine this theory and its implications for how we understand human consciousness. The basic question which Bergson and Broad ask is whether the brain's primary function is to produce conscious experience of our world, or rather act like a filter and merely reduce and eliminate some sensory input in order to help us make our experience in the world more comprehensible and manageable. Allow me to explain. A long-time dominant assumption about the brain is that it produces consciousness for our mind and body. This can be termed the materialistic perspective. It assumes that when the body dies, the mind loses consciousness, hence the individual life is extinguished, like the flame on a candle. On the other hand, Bergson and Broad suggest that the brain does not produce consciousness. Rather, the brain transmits consciousness like a radio that receives and transmits radio signals. These ideas have relevance to the manner in which we define reality itself, whether that be some notion of an ultimate reality or even everyday so-called common sense reality. Anytime you engage in a discussion of the nature of reality, you should acknowledge the metaphysical assumptions underlying such discussions. I hasten to add that all scientific theories, whether their proponents acknowledge it or not, possess metaphysical assumptions. I want to acknowledge the metaphysical assumption underlying the theory of Bergson and Broad. It is the assumption known as a state of neutral monism. To understand and appreciate the meaning of this term and how it differs from a materialistic perspective, we need to review some basic philosophical ideas. This involves the concepts of dualism and idealism, among others. In this chart, we can see these ideas illustrated. In each sector, the physical or material world is represented by the P, and the mental dimension or mind is identified by the M. The essential difference is regarding which dimension or substance is deemed fundamental or foundational and which is secondary or derived from the first. The 17th century French philosopher Descartes is famous for his dualistic theory in which mind and matter are co-equals but inhabit strangely separate dimensions of human life. Modern science, in contrast, has for the most part replaced Cartesian dualism with a simpler concept, that of metaphysical naturalism, identified on this chart as physicalism. It is the view that the observable material world is the only reality. It is a monistic view, but in this monism there is just one substance, namely physical matter. Thus, the physical world is primary, while mind and our mental world is simply a byproduct of physical activities. In many respects, this is the opposite of classical idealism, in which mind was deemed the central reality and matter was a derivative from it. Finally, the 20th century witnessed the emergence of neutral monism, a concept first coined and advanced by the American philosopher William James. Neutral monism holds that neither mind nor matter is the principal or foundational dimension of reality. Rather, there is a third substance that gives rise to both mind and matter. Perhaps the best explanation for the rationale for a metaphysic of neutral monism is that which was provided by the English philosopher Bertrand Russell just over 100 years ago. Russell summarized his rationale for endorsing James's theory of neutral monism this way. On the one hand, he pointed out that many psychologists in the 20th century had tended to adopt a very materialistic position. They made psychology increasingly dependent on physiology and external observation, and tended to think of matter as something much more solid and substantial than mind. Meanwhile, Russell pointed out, Physicists, especially Einstein and other exponents of the theory of relativity, have been making matter less and less material. The world of modern physics consists of events from which matter is derived by a logical construction. On this account, Russell concluded that old-fashioned materialism can receive no support from modern physics. So while psychologists may assume matter is the ultimate reality, modern physics itself cannot be called materialistic in the same manner these psychologists might assume. This is because modern physics no longer supports an understanding of the existence of matter as we ordinarily conceive it. By 1975, this curious relationship between modern physics and human consciousness, especially as understood by Eastern mystical traditions, was explored in Capper's book, The Tao of Physics. Capper's book brought the implications of subatomic physics to popular consciousness for the very first time. Anyone interested in a fuller examination of these ideas should not hesitate to pick up this book. Returning to the theory of Bergson and Broad, we can now explore the implications of both neutral monism and the idea that our brain does not produce sensory input for us, but rather transmits it. This means in some respects the brain functions like a filter or reducing valve so that we are not overwhelmed by more sensory input than we can put to use in our daily lives. Think of it this way. Consider the full spectrum of light and sound. As humans, we can only access a limited dimension of audible frequencies, while other animals can process frequencies well beyond our capacity. And when it comes to visible light, we are even more limited, as we can see in this chart below. Let's summarize now the implications of our discussion. If the brain transmits consciousness, then its main function is not productive, but eliminative. It reduces the potential bandwidth of consciousness that we might potentially experience, limiting our external perceptions to that which is critical to our everyday survival in the world in which we interact, our external environment. Other dimensions of the bandwidth of consciousness are filtered out by the brain so that we can walk, talk, and interact with our environment in a manner that maximizes our survival in the external world in which we live. As a filter or reducing valve, the brain does not necessarily generate spiritually significant experiences unless we cultivate our potential to do so by accessing a broader realm of consciousness, which we do by directing our attention inwards rather than outwards towards our physical environments. I wish to pick up on that last point, since it is the reason why Huxley discusses the theory of Bergson and Broad in The Doors of Perception. Huxley's essay examines the nature of visionary experience or mystical consciousness, experiences that may emerge when we direct our attention inwards. The theory of neutral monism, in which consciousness is deemed the underlying reality that gives rise to mind and matter, provides an explanation for our capacity for visionary, religious, or mystical experience. Hence, underlying every individual mind is a cosmic field of energy, an ocean of consciousness that is contiguous with the brain and human consciousness. For Huxley, spiritual disciplines which direct our attention inwards, as well as some psychedelics, may allow us to enlarge our experience, to experience transcendence in which we transcend the reality we are normally limited to by our brain's function as a filter or reducing valve. By moving beyond our perception of the environment that allows us to survive in our day-to-day lives, we are nonetheless opening ourselves to a dimension of experience that holds immense relevance to our endeavor to infuse meaning into our lives. Consciousness can be seen as the cosmic fabric of all creation. The mind, the body, and the environments in which we live are mere knotted ripples and patterns in the fabric of consciousness. In the final analysis, I believe that we must conclude that both perspectives have merit. That is, contemporary neuroscience maintains that the brain's neuroplasticity underscores the idea that our family, our language, and our culture all shape the growing brain and thereby shape our experience, especially our experience of the outer environment. On the other hand, insofar as we have a capacity for directing our attention inwards, we may then cultivate an expanded, altered state of consciousness. On this account, we have at least the potential to access a dimension of human consciousness that transcends both individual and cultural experience. These topics form the central concern of the theory of visionary experience that Aldous Huxley advanced after the appearance of The Doors of Perception in 1954. That theory of Huxley's will be examined more carefully in another presentation.